and welcome back to the committee. I've got two questions. One kind of has to do with philosophy of managing these assets, and the other is just kind of a quick question about the tax collections. And you mentioned that the TARP funds are being repaid quicker than and in a greater amount than first thought, and I think that's good news. And I think we ought to do everything we can to maximize those dollars. But it looks like there are two different. When you look at AIG, it seems to be, again, we're a majority, I guess, shareholder, and so I guess we're involved in their decisions. And it seems to me, I read they sold two life companies last week, $51 billion, which will go back to American taxpayers. That's good news. But if the philosophy there is to sell off these assets, it seems to me sooner or later you'll kind of run out of assets to sell. You'll have a company that's kind of been downsized, and you wonder what kind of capability it will have to make any further payments. I think they have over $100 billion, and I think they paid back 15 maybe. So we're still on the hook. Now, on the other hand, when I look at General Motors, as I understand it, if you take General Motors, Chrysler, and GMAC, we maybe gave them $80 billion, and I think maybe General Motors was about $50 billion of that. And then I read where you said, well, we're probably going to lose $30 billion on the General Motors deal. But I guess it seems like if the philosophy there is GM is kind of, they've reinstated some of the dealerships. They're increasing their sales. Maybe their market share is going to increase. So you would think, that's one way to deal with the situation. You would think if they become an ongoing entity and grow and increase sales and increase market share, they'll be even in a better position to pay back, of the $50 billion. Maybe they end up paying it all back. But so just help me understand the two different philosophies, because since we must be involved in those decisions. And is it short-sighted on the AIG? I'm not asking whether we should have just, broken it up early on, but we own it, and we want to get paid back as much as we can. So and those are two different kind of case studies. Explain to me how it's working, how you think that works in the long run.
Excellent question, and it is a difficult judgment. The two basic objectives we try to balance are to maximize the return to the taxpayer, minimize the risk of loss to the taxpayer, and we want to, frankly, get out as quickly as we can. Those two objectives will sometimes be in conflict, as you said. So we're going to try to balance them. These companies where we're reluctant shareholders in these companies are in dramatically different positions. And the precise strategy we adopt in those cases is going to differ because of different conditions. But that's what we're going to try to make sure we manage these in a way to minimize any risk of loss, maximize the achievable return, but we want to get out as quickly as we can because we don't want to have the American government involved in these companies a day longer than is necessary. So we'll do it as quickly as we can, subject to that constraint that we don't want to leave the American taxpayer exposed to the risk of unnecessary loss in that case. You're right to point out that we are making really remarkable progress. I would say the board of AIG is making remarkable progress in reducing the risk and restructuring the company in a way that is going to reduce the expected loss to the taxpayer very, very dramatically. They've come down dramatically over that period of time. We're still exposed to substantial risk of loss, as we are in the auto companies. But we're going to be very careful in managing those in a way to balance those two basic objectives. Again, I think we're being consistent in applying them, but where they differ, it's just because of the inherent differences in the position of those companies and the opportunities we have to get out earlier.
Thank you. And the second question is just a brief question. I read in your testimony where there are going to be some new initiatives in terms of tax collection. Like you spend $250 million, which will, according to your testimony, that's going to bring in another $2 billion. And every time I read that, I can't help but kind of ask the question, how do you determine that spending $250 billion on compliance is going to end up bringing you $2 billion? And then based on that, how do you decide, well, instead of spending $500 billion, we get $500 million, we get $400 billion, or up and down the scale. So I'm just curious because my colleagues know that from time to time, members of Congress use the so-called tax gap as like a piggy bank, and we say all you got to do if you spend $1 billion, you get this. And I've always wondered, is there any facts and figures that kind of verify that, and how do you decide to limit it to $250 billion, $250 million, to say that'll get us $2 billion, and somebody says, well, gee, 4 times that would get you 4 times the money.
I asked the same questions when we were having an initial discussion with Commissioner Schulman about what made sense in this area. I think what he will tell you, I think he told you when he was up here before, and I'd be happy to provide him more detail in writing and answer that question. But what he said is that those are pretty conservative estimates based on experience over in the past of putting more enforcement resources in target areas to generate better compliance. I think they're pretty conservative. I've seen much higher estimates than that. On the question which I asked, the same question is, well, why not more? If the return's that high, now why not more? And part of it is just their judgment about the pace at which they can really bring on capable people to do this. You know, there are some constraints on how quickly you can scale up those operations. And we're trying to be relatively careful, given that we don't live in a world of unlimited resources, to do it in ways where we're confident you're going to see a high return. That's the best answer I can give, but I'd be happy to follow up.
No, I appreciate that. I guess that you've stolen the ideas of all the members of Congress, so we can't go talk about spending an extra $250 million to get another $4 billion, because you've maxed out on that.
The virtue of what your colleague just pointed out, which is CBO is the arbiter of the extent to which you can actually justify investments on some return like that. We don't get to decide. You guys get to decide based on those estimates.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.